I still remember the exact sound of the pen sliding across the polished oak table before my husband pushed it toward me. It wasn't loud, but in that silent room it felt like a door closing on 7 years of my life. "Sign whenever you're ready," Daniel said without looking directly at me. His voice carried the confidence of a man who believed every outcome had already been decided. I stared at the papers instead of his face. Divorce. The word should have broken me. It should have made my chest tighten, my eyes fill with tears, my hands reach across the table to beg for another chance. Instead, I had to fight the urge to smile. I curled my fingers into a fist beneath the table until my nails pressed painfully into my palm. I couldn't let him notice. He had always been convinced he understood me better than anyone else. If he realized I had been waiting for this moment almost as eagerly as he had, it would ruin everything. "Emily," he sighed, mistaking my silence for heartbreak, "I know this is difficult." Difficult? I almost laughed. The difficult part had been pretending for years that our marriage still meant something while he slowly replaced me with a younger woman who believed she had discovered the world's greatest man. "I'm sorry," he continued. "Sophie deserves a real future. She deserves honesty." There it was again. His favorite excuse. She was innocent. She was different. She was everything I apparently wasn't anymore. I simply nodded, pretending my trembling hands came from emotional pain instead of barely controlled excitement. Daniel reached across the table as though he wanted to comfort me but stopped halfway, remembering he no longer had the right. "I never wanted to hurt you." That sentence almost made me choke. Never wanted to hurt me? Then what exactly had the endless business trips been? What about the late-night phone calls he answered outside? The perfume that wasn't mine? The birthdays he missed because some important client suddenly needed him? The first affair had nearly destroyed me. I had caught him by accident when a message appeared on his phone while he was showering. He had cried harder than I had. He knelt on the kitchen floor promising it would never happen again, swearing I was the only woman he had ever truly loved. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. That forgiveness became permission. One affair turned into another, then another after that. Eventually I stopped asking where he had been because I already knew the answer. The strange thing was that he never imagined I would leave. In his mind I was permanent, like the furniture in our home or the framed wedding photographs hanging on the walls. I existed to welcome him back no matter what he had done. I overheard him telling one of his friends exactly that one evening. "Emily would never betray me," he had said with complete certainty. "She complains sometimes, but she'll always be waiting when I get home." Those words stayed with me longer than any confession of infidelity ever could. They forced me to ask a question I had avoided for years. Why was loyalty expected from me but optional for him? Why was my happiness considered less important than his freedom? I spent months trying to convince myself I could rebuild our marriage. I read books, suggested counseling, blamed myself for problems I hadn't created. Then one rainy Thursday evening everything changed. I had stopped at a small cafe after work simply to escape the weather. Every table was occupied except one across from a stranger wearing a charcoal coat and reading a novel while drinking black coffee. When I asked if the seat was free, he smiled without lifting his eyes from the page. "Only if you don't mind sharing the silence." That was how I met Adrian. There was nothing dramatic about our first conversation. We discussed books, terrible coffee, and why the rain always seemed heavier after sunset. He never flirted. He never asked if I was married. When we stood to leave, he wished me a pleasant evening as though we had known each other for years. I should have forgotten him immediately, yet somehow I didn't. We crossed paths again a week later, then again at an art exhibition neither of us had planned to attend. It became almost amusing how often coincidence placed us in the same room. Months passed before I admitted to myself that I looked forward to seeing him. Adrian listened when I spoke. Really listened. He remembered details about conversations I had forgotten myself. When I mentioned loving old bookstores, he casually invited me to one hidden in a narrow side street that I had somehow never discovered despite living nearby for years. He never pressured me. He simply made me realize how invisible I had become inside my own marriage. By the time Daniel decided he wanted a divorce, my heart had already packed its bags long ago. He simply hadn't noticed. His phone vibrated again on the table. The screen lit up with Sophie's name for what must have been the 6th time in 10 minutes. He rejected the call, but she immediately called again. This time he answered. "I'm almost done," he whispered impatiently. "Just give me another hour." Her voice was loud enough that I could hear her crying through the speaker. "You promised. You said nothing would stop us from being together." Daniel glanced at me apologetically before ending the call. "She's anxious," he explained. "She loves me." I almost asked whether he remembered saying the same thing about me years earlier. Instead, I focused on the documents. He was offering me our house, savings, and a generous settlement. On paper it looked fair. But fairness wasn't what interested me anymore. I calmly closed the folder and looked directly into his eyes for the first time that afternoon. "I don't want a larger check," I said quietly. "I want 35% of your voting shares in Ashford Technologies." His confident expression disappeared instantly. For the first time since walking into my apartment, Daniel looked genuinely surprised. Daniel stared at me as though I had suddenly begun speaking another language. For several long seconds he didn't blink, didn't move, didn't even attempt to hide his disbelief. "My shares," he repeated slowly. "Why would you want part of the company?" I folded my hands calmly on the table. "Because I helped build it." He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. We both knew the truth. 12 years earlier, Ashford Technologies had been nothing more than a struggling startup operating from a rented office above an old grocery store. Daniel had the ideas, but ideas alone never paid salaries. I was the one who stayed awake preparing investor presentations after finishing my own full-time job. I attended networking dinners, organized meetings, balanced budgets, and convinced skeptical partners that his vision deserved a chance. I celebrated every contract as though it belonged to both of us because, back then, I truly believed it did. Once the company became successful, my role quietly disappeared from the story. Daniel became the brilliant founder everyone admired. I became his supportive wife. Convenient history has a habit of forgetting women who stand behind successful men. "The company is different now," he finally said. "It's much bigger." "Exactly," I answered. "Which is why my contribution is worth something." He leaned back in his chair, clearly calculating the consequences. Cash could be earned again. Shares meant influence. Ownership. A permanent reminder that I had existed long before the young assistant who now believed she had won some grand romantic prize. His lawyer cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Carter, perhaps there's room for negotiation." Daniel shot him an irritated glance before rubbing his forehead. His phone vibrated once again. "Sophie." He ignored it this time. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Am I?" I asked softly. I thought honesty was important. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. After another minute of tense silence, he exhaled heavily. "Fine. 35%. Voting shares," I reminded him. "Not their cash value." His jaw tightened. "You planned this." I smiled politely without answering. In reality, I hadn't planned revenge. I had planned survival. There was a difference. The lawyer spent the next hour revising every page of the agreement while Daniel paced around the office answering increasingly emotional calls from Sophie. Even without hearing her words, I could imagine the conversation perfectly. She probably pictured me throwing glasses across the room, refusing to sign, begging my husband to stay. The truth would have disappointed her. I was sitting comfortably by the window enjoying the best coffee I'd had in weeks. When the new documents finally arrived, I read every line twice before signing my name. My handwriting remained perfectly steady. Daniel noticed. "You seem calmer now." "I've accepted reality." That much was true. We drove together to the courthouse because it was easier than taking separate cars. Halfway there, I noticed a glitter-covered sticker attached to the passenger dashboard. "Princess's seat. Please don't touch." I raised an eyebrow. Daniel looked embarrassed for the first time all day. Sophie has a playful personality. Clearly. I moved into the back seat without another word. During the drive, my phone vibrated repeatedly inside my purse. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Adrian had left that morning for a 3-day architecture conference in another city, and ever since his train departed, he had been sending me photos of every interesting building he found. The latest message simply read, "Found a bookstore you'd love. Saving it for us." I couldn't stop the tiny smile that appeared on my face. "What's funny?" Daniel asked through the rearview mirror. "Nothing important. You've been smiling at your phone. People do that sometimes." He frowned but said nothing else. A few minutes later he cleared his throat again. "After everything is finalized, if you ever need financial help, you can still call me." The offer sounded generous, almost noble. Once, hearing those words would have made me grateful. Now they simply sounded strange. "Thank you," I replied. "I don't think I'll need to." He seemed almost disappointed by my answer. "You're taking this better than I expected." I looked out the window at people crossing busy intersections, completely unaware that one marriage was ending inside the black sedan waiting at the traffic light. "Maybe you never really knew me." That sentence lingered between us for the rest of the drive. The divorce itself took less than 20 minutes. A few signatures. A few official stamps. 2 polite congratulations from a clerk who probably processed dozens of broken marriages every week. Just like that, 7 years became paperwork stored in a government archive. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt unusually warm. Daniel offered to drive me home, but another desperate call from Sophie interrupted him before I could answer. "I should go," he admitted. "She's waiting." "Of course she is." He hesitated as though expecting me to cry or accuse him of ruining my life. Instead, I simply wished him well. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." He searched my face for anger, sadness, anything familiar. Finding none, he nodded awkwardly before hurrying toward his car. I watched him disappear into traffic without feeling the emptiness I had imagined divorce would bring. If anything, I felt lighter. Like someone had quietly unlocked a door I hadn't realized was keeping me trapped. I didn't tell Adrian what had happened that day. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wasn't ready to define whatever existed between us. Freedom was still new, fragile, almost unbelievable. For the first time in years, I wanted to discover who I was before deciding who I might become with someone else. I slipped my phone back into my bag and started walking through the city with no destination in mind, smiling at the strange realization that sometimes the end of one story isn't a tragedy at all. Sometimes it's simply the first peaceful chapter of a completely different life. 5 days after the divorce became official, I discovered just how badly Sophie wanted the world to know she had one. She uploaded a carefully staged photograph to social media, her hand intertwined with Daniel's, matching rings sparkling beneath a caption about finally choosing happiness. It wasn't subtle. She knew I would see it because, months earlier, she had insisted on following me. I had ignored the request several times before accidentally accepting it one evening. Looking back, I suspected it hadn't been an accident at all. She wanted an audience, and I was supposed to be the main one. I looked at the picture for perhaps 3 seconds before locking my phone. I didn't feel jealous. If anything, I felt strangely detached, as though I were looking at complete strangers. Later that week, an old college friend celebrated his birthday and invited nearly everyone from our former circle. I almost declined. The chances of seeing Daniel were high, and I had no interest in awkward conversations or forced politeness. But then I realized something important. Avoiding places because my ex-husband might be there meant I was still allowing him to shape my life. I refused to keep doing that. The restaurant buzzed with laughter when I arrived. Before I even reached our private room, I heard familiar voices teasing someone inside. "So when's the wedding?" one of Daniel's friends joked. "I still can't believe Emily actually agreed to the divorce. We all thought she'd fight for you." Another laughed. "Seriously, what magic words did you use? She used to look at you like you were the center of the universe." I pushed the door open before Daniel had the chance to answer. "No magic," I said with a pleasant smile. "We simply reached a fair agreement." Every conversation stopped instantly. You could almost hear the music from the main dining room filling the silence. My friend hurried over with an exaggerated grin, desperate to rescue the atmosphere. "Emily. Perfect timing. Come sit down." I thanked him and took the empty chair across from Daniel. Sophie sat beside him wearing a bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. Throughout dinner I caught her studying me repeatedly. She expected sadness. Or resentment. Anything that would confirm she had defeated someone. Unfortunately for her, I was mostly focused on deciding whether the roasted salmon was overcooked. Finally she placed her wineglass on the table and stood. "Emily," she began sweetly enough for everyone to notice, "I just wanted to say I appreciate how smoothly everything ended. Daniel sacrificed a lot during the divorce, but I never complained because love is more important than money." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She raised her glass toward me. "I only hope we can all move forward without unnecessary misunderstandings." I smiled politely without lifting my own drink. Her expression tightened almost immediately. "Don't you have anything to say?" she asked. Daniel quietly touched her arm. "Let's not do this." She gently moved his hand away. "No, I think it's healthy to clear the air." Then she looked directly at me. "Can you promise everyone here that you won't keep interfering in our relationship?" Around the table, eyes bounced nervously between us. Apparently everyone expected drama. I folded my napkin carefully before answering. "I have absolutely no interest in interfering." Relief flashed across a few faces. Then I continued. "I don't revisit chapters I've already finished reading." The room became silent again. Sophie forced a laugh. "That's good to hear." "It should be," I replied calmly. "Although I do find one thing amusing." She blinked. "What?" "You keep talking as though someone stole him from me." "That's not how this happened." I looked toward Daniel before returning my attention to her. "People aren't prizes. They're responsible for their own choices." Daniel finally spoke. "Emily." "No," I interrupted gently. "Let's be honest for once. He wasn't taken. He walked away." Nobody said another word. Sophie sat down stiffly, clearly unhappy that the conversation hadn't unfolded according to her script. The birthday celebrations slowly resumed, though the earlier laughter never fully returned. About 20 minutes later the door opened again. I glanced up casually, and nearly laughed out loud. Adrian stood in the doorway carrying a neatly wrapped gift. He had returned from his conference earlier than expected. His eyes searched the room for less than a second before finding mine. His entire expression softened immediately. "Sorry I'm late," he said to the host before walking directly toward our table. Several people recognized him instantly. Adrian Brooks wasn't famous, but his architectural firm had become one of the fastest-growing companies in the city. More importantly, he possessed the kind of effortless confidence that naturally drew attention without trying. He reached my chair, noticed my jacket folded behind me, and quietly placed it across my shoulders. "You always forget restaurants turn the air conditioning into winter," he said with an amused smile. I wasn't cold. "You would have been in 5 minutes." He pulled out the empty chair beside me as though sitting there had always been the obvious choice. Daniel watched the exchange with visible confusion. "You two know each other?" Adrian looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Of course." Then he smiled at me. "She still hasn't admitted we're spending more weekends together than apart." I nearly choked on my water. "Adrian." "What?" he asked innocently. "I'm simply stating facts." Laughter finally returned to the room, this time entirely at Sophie's expense. Even the birthday host relaxed. Daniel, however, remained unusually quiet. For the first time since our marriage ended, I saw uncertainty replacing certainty in his eyes. He wasn't looking at Adrian with jealousy exactly. It was something more complicated. It was the expression of a man realizing that the story he had always believed about his own importance might never have been true at all. Dinner ended much later than anyone had planned. Conversations eventually returned to safer subjects, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that couldn't be repaired. Daniel barely spoke for the rest of the evening, and Sophie tried far too hard to convince everyone she was enjoying herself. Every few minutes she laughed louder than necessary or reached for Daniel's hand as though reminding the room, and perhaps herself, that she still occupied the seat she had fought to claim. Adrian, meanwhile, behaved as though none of it interested him. He asked our host about an upcoming charity project, complimented the chef, and quietly placed another bread roll onto my plate after noticing I had barely touched my dinner. "You're doing it again," he murmured. "Doing what?" "Pretending a glass of wine counts as a meal." I rolled my eyes. "I've eaten. Half a salad isn't dinner." He slid the bread closer with complete confidence. "Humor me." I laughed softly and took a bite. Across the table, Daniel noticed the exchange. During 7 years of marriage, he had never once remembered whether I skipped meals when I was stressed. Adrian had known me for less than a year and somehow noticed everything without making it feel like an obligation. The contrast wasn't intentional. It simply existed. When the party finally ended, guests began saying their goodbyes in small groups. Adrian collected my coat before I had the chance to stand. "I'll drive you home," he said naturally. "You don't have to." "I know." He smiled. "I want to." Outside, the evening air was cool and quiet. The city lights reflected across rain-soaked streets while Adrian unlocked his car. Neither of us spoke until we were several blocks away. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. I leaned my head against the window and watched passing buildings blur together. "Surprisingly, yes." He nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. He looked confused tonight. I glanced toward him. "Daniel?" "He expected to leave your life." Adrian kept his attention on the road. "He didn't expect you to build a better one without him." I considered those words for several moments. They felt accurate. During our marriage, Daniel had always assumed he would remain the most important person in my story, even after ending it himself. Seeing me genuinely happy had challenged a belief he probably never realized he carried. Adrian changed the subject before I could overthink it. "By the way, I found that bookstore I mentioned." "You actually remembered?" He looked genuinely offended. "Emily, I remember everything you tell me." I smiled without realizing it. "There's a first edition you've been looking for," he continued. "The owner agreed to hold it until Saturday." "You planned my weekend already?" "Only the interesting parts." We both laughed. It felt effortless, the kind of laughter that doesn't require pretending. When we reached my apartment building, neither of us hurried to leave the car. The silence between us was comfortable rather than awkward. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian said after a moment. "Of course." He rested one hand on the steering wheel. Back at the restaurant, when I called you my favorite person. He paused, searching for the right words. I wasn't joking. My heartbeat quickened slightly. He wasn't rushing me. He wasn't demanding an answer. He was simply telling the truth. I know, I replied quietly. And I wasn't uncomfortable hearing it. A warm smile spread across his face, smaller than his usual grin but somehow more meaningful. That's probably the best news I've had all week. A few days later I officially began attending shareholder meetings at Ashford Technologies. Predictably, several executives assumed I would quietly approve whatever Daniel recommended. They quickly discovered they were mistaken. I had spent years helping build the company before anyone knew its name. I understood the business better than most people in the room expected. My questions became sharper with every meeting. My suggestions were backed by careful research rather than emotion. Even directors who had initially doubted me gradually began asking for my opinion before major decisions. Daniel remained professional throughout. We rarely spoke outside official discussions, but whenever we did, there was an unfamiliar respect between us. Perhaps losing our marriage had finally forced him to recognize the partner he had overlooked for years. Several months passed. Winter slowly gave way to spring. Adrian and I never rushed to define our relationship, yet somehow it naturally became exactly that. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered birthdays, favorite books, and small promises most people forgot within hours. When work became overwhelming, he brought dinner to my office without announcing he was coming. When I doubted myself before an important presentation, he listened instead of offering empty encouragement. He never tried to solve every problem for me. He simply stood beside me while I solved them myself. One Saturday afternoon, after wandering through the little bookstore he had discovered months earlier, we sat together in a nearby park watching children chase pigeons across the square. Adrian looked unusually serious. I think I've been patient long enough. I laughed softly. Patient about what? About asking properly. He reached for my hand. Emily, would you let me be part of your future? There were no dramatic speeches. No expensive restaurant. No audience. Just warm sunshine, fresh coffee, and the quiet certainty that peace often arrives disguised as ordinary moments. I looked at the man beside me and realized something that had taken years to understand. Real love wasn't exhausting. It didn't require constant forgiveness, endless waiting, or proving my worth over and over again. It felt safe. It felt steady. It felt like finally coming home after wandering for far too long. I smiled and gently squeezed his hand. Yes, I whispered. I'd like that very much. Months later I heard through mutual friends that Daniel and Sophie had ended their relationship. There had been arguments, jealousy, and disappointment, nothing dramatic, only the slow collapse of a romance built on unrealistic expectations. When someone eventually asked whether I felt satisfied knowing it hadn't worked out for them, I surprised myself with my answer. No, I said honestly. I don't need their unhappiness to appreciate my happiness. Looking back now, I don't think my story was ever about revenge. It was about rediscovering the woman I had slowly abandoned while trying to save a marriage that only one person valued. Losing Daniel didn't ruin my life. It forced me to build one that finally belonged to me. And as I closed another book while Adrian prepared coffee in the kitchen, I realized that sometimes the happiest endings begin the exact moment you stop begging someone else to choose you, and finally choose yourself.